Yeah, Fire Lord Iroh. And by Fire Lord Iroh, obviously, I mean, what if Iroh became Fire Lord? And there's many scenarios in which this could have happened. So, obviously, it could have happened if maybe Iroh decided to take the throne after the 100-Year War. So after Ozai got defeated by Aang, maybe Iroh decides to become the Fire Lord instead of Zuko. So it could have happened that way, in which case it would just have been very peaceful and Iroh would have ruled for several years and then eventually handed it off to Zuko. And then there's the other scenarios where maybe Iroh becomes Fire Lord after Azulan's death, meaning 5 years before Aang reappears. So that could have happened in a few different ways. So there's a scenario if Lu Ten survives and the scenario if Lu Ten dies. So let's go with the scenario where Lu Ten survives first. Let's say Lu Ten survives, then in that case Ozai is not really going to have the excuse to ask his father Azulan for the throne. And so Azulan's not going to get mad and tell Ozai to get rid of Zuko as punishment for what Ozai said about Iroh. So Ursa's not going to poison Azulan. So in that case, Azulan will remain alive. And the thing with Azulan is that obviously he was 95 years old. He was 95 years old when he died, but he died because of the poison that Ursa gave him, or Ozai gave him. Ursa made the poison, but Ozai is the one who administered it. But the point is, sure, Azulan could have lived for several more years. I mean, we see that Bumi is 112, and, you know, in real life, some people live to be 118. And so, and some people live to be 102, and Azulan's own father, Fire Lord Sozin, lived to be 102. So, sure, Azulan could have lived for about 7 more years because he was 95. Or he could have just died quickly after. Because if you remember Azulan saying that Azula, Zuko's sister, saying that Azulan, Zuko's grandfather, is not so powerful and up to the task anymore because he's so old, and she's like, someone's going to take his place soon. And so, I mean, it could have just been Azula gaslighting and exaggerating. Or maybe, he didn't look great, but he was, standing in a room full of fire, so obviously he's going to look a little damp, and he's going to be sweating a little bit, and so he's not going to look great. And, when you're 95, you're not going to look like you're 20, so... And he looked pretty good for 95, I'd have to say, Azulan did. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know how many more years Azulan would have lived, but I suppose it depends on that, so... So let's just say Azulan lives for about 7 more years. 5 more years, and then he's 100 years old, and then Aang reappears. He gets out of the iceberg. And then Aang gets trained by... let's just say Aang still gets trained by... let's just say everything in The Last Airbender turns out exactly the same way it did in the original timeline. Aang would still be... So Aang would get trained and he would be very powerful, but instead of Ozai, he'll be fighting against Azulan. And, I mean, think about it. A 12-year-old Avatar who's fairly powerful, fighting against a 100-year-old Fire Lord who's also very powerful, but... Yeah, who is immensely powerful, but is still 100 years old, so... Maybe Aang would have an even easier time defeating Azulan, and maybe Iroh would just defect to Aang's side and then say, oh, the Fire Nation was wrong, and we're sorry, and now I'm the Fire Lord, and yeah, my father Azulan can go to prison, and I'll be the Fire Lord. And so maybe Aang would defeat Azulan, and then Iroh would just become Fire Lord, and things would all be good. Or, yeah, I mean, it's possible that Iroh would just betray the Fire Nation right when he hears that Aang survived, Aang is around, or maybe he would betray it later and then teach Aang firebending or something. It's hard to say. And obviously Azulan would have to make it that far, and how does Ozai play out in this timeline? Because does Ozai... Yeah, I mean, Ozai is a loose cannon, is all I will say. So that's one scenario. And then the other scenario, and then so obviously Iroh would just become the Fire Lord, and then maybe hand it off to Lu Ten later. And then the other scenario is, what if Lu Ten did not die? What if Lu Ten died, but Iroh still became Fire Lord somehow? And there's a few ways that could happen. So the first way that could happen is maybe, even maybe Ursa and Ozai still get rid of Azulan. Fire Lord Azulan still passes, but maybe the difference in this scenario is that the fire sages decide to ignore Ozai, and even though Ozai claims that Azulan's final wish was that Ozai become the Fire Lord, maybe the fire sages are just like, now we don't believe it, or now we don't care, and then they just give it to Iroh anyway. And so Iroh becomes Fire Lord, and Ursa's still been banished, but Ozai, Azula, and Zuko still remain. And it's possible that Ozai would just be very clever and do away with Iroh, like Ozai would assassinate Iroh, basically. But Iroh's really smart too. I mean, Ozai's smart, but Iroh's also really smart, so it's possible Iroh would see through the plot and put Ozai in prison, and then maybe he would do something about Azula too, because he knows how dangerous she is. So, I mean, it's hard to say what would happen in that scenario, because... And then would Zuko become Iroh's heir apparent later? And then how would Iroh handle the return of the Avatar? It's possible that with the death of Lu-Ten, with Lu-Ten dead, Iroh would still change and still go through a metamorphosis, even though... And maybe he would just... It's possible that Iroh would just become the Fire Lord, and then end the 100-Year War. Like, it would all just be over, and he would stop the fighting and maybe pay reparations to the Water Tribes and the Earth Kingdom. And once the Avatar returns, maybe Iroh would just reach out his hand and work with the Avatar, work with Aang. Iroh would work with Aang, and they would become friends and work on restoring balance and peace to the world. Something like that. I mean, obviously, Iroh would... I guess he would already be involved with the White Lotus. I mean, I'm not really sure when exactly he started getting involved, but he was a Grand Lotus, so he'd been involved with them for a while. So I think in that scenario, Iroh would just become the Fire Lord, and he would immediately put a stop to the war, maybe put Ozai in prison, and then so Iroh would become Fire Lord, put Azula and Ozai in prison, and then Iroh would end the war, work with a White Lotus to restore balance and peace, and once the Avatar returns, he would work with the Avatar as well, and the White Lotus and the Avatar would work together, and Fire Lord, White Lotus, Avatar would work together, and they would all restore balance and peace to the world. So that's one way it could happen. And then the other way it could happen is if Ursa was more clever, and maybe she used the poison on Ozai instead of Azula, so she just used the poison on Ozai, and then maybe she just takes Zuko and flees. Or she just takes Zuko and flees, and Iroh returns and just becomes the Fire Lord. Or maybe Ursa uses the poison on Ozai, and then no. If Ursa used the poison on Ozai and then took Zuko and fled, well, then Azula would just remain Fire Lord and continue the war. I don't really think Azula doesn't really seem to care that much about Ursa, Zuko, or Azula at all. I mean, I know Azula was very nice to Ursa in the Search comics, but I mean, that's just their first meeting, and obviously you're going to be very nice to the person who's going to become your daughter-in-law during your first meeting, and then maybe just not really, and then maybe after you've known each other for a while, that might change, it might not be as nice anymore, so that's the thing. And I don't think Azula would really care that Ozai said it all. Like, I think he just wouldn't care. And Iroh would just return. Or it's possible that Ursa would poison Ozai and then maybe confess to Azula. I think Azula would just pardon her and not really care, because, as I said, Azula was very angry with Ozai and didn't like him either. So, or maybe Ursa would poison Ozai and Azula and then go tell Iroh what happened, and then Iroh would be nice and then say, it's fine, you can stay, and Zuko can be my heir now, something like that. So, yeah, Iroh becoming Fire Lord will be a very interesting scenario. And just to recap, as I said, Azula was 95 years old, so it wasn't clear how long he would live, if he would have lived if he had not, been poisoned by Ursa. So if Azula hadn't been poisoned, how long would he have lived? It's unclear, because as I said, his father Sozin lived to be 102, but in real life, Jimmy Carter's mom, Lillian, only lived to be 85. She died in 1983. Whereas Jimmy Carter's dad, Jimmy Carter Sr., only lived to be 59. He died in 1953. Yeah, so Jimmy Carter's dad was 53 years old, 53 years old, and Jimmy Carter's mom was 85 years old, and they died at those ages. Like so, but Jimmy Carter is turning 98 this year, and he's still alive. And Rosalind Carter's dad also died pretty young, I believe, but she's turning 95 this year. And then of course there's the added caveat that Herbert Hoover's parents only lived to be in their 30s, and they died, whereas Herbert Hoover lived to the age of 90. And then there's a added fact that who was I going to talk about now? Oh yeah, John McCain's mother. John McCain, horrible war criminal, by the way, just like Susan. But John McCain's mother, Roberta, lived to be 108. She actually lived longer than 2 of her 3 children. Yeah, obviously her daughter Sandy died at the age of 85 in 2019, whereas her son John, the horrible war criminal, he died at the age of 82 in 2018. But as I said, their mother Roberta died at the age of 108 in 2020. And so it's not like it doesn't. Your parents can live long and you can still live a short time, or your parents can live a short time and you can still live a long time. So just because Sozin lived to be 102 doesn't mean that Azulan would have necessarily lived to be 102 just because he was Sozin's son. Like, it's not all about genetics. It's really about circumstances and stuff that happens. And just individuals are very different apart from their families. So maybe Azulan would have just died anyway at 95, or maybe Azulan would have lived to be 102, or maybe Azulan could have lived to be 140, who knows. As I said, he didn't look too great, but that was a flashback, and obviously when you're sitting in a massive pool of fire and you're 95 years old, you're going to be sweating and you're not going to look great in the lighting, so that's the thing. Who knows?